Okay, welcome to the Saving Science video series. In this series, I will attempt to answer the following question. Does academic science need to be saved? And by academic science, I mean scientific research that's being conducted in universities where the majority of scientific research takes place. To answer the question, I will tell you many stories about my strange adventures in academia. I observed many strange things that suggest the entire system is broken and is still broken at every level, with each level being broken in many different ways. But how could this be? This is science. This is academia, the bedrock of an enlightened society. Well, around 2008, which is now 12 years ago, I began on a journey to resolve this mystery. Now being in academia for 20 years, how could it be possible that so many smart people could operate in a system that broken in that many ways for that long? And how come no one is doing anything serious about it? And small improvements have been made recently, but only negligible ways, as we'll see. And so my promise to you is this. By the end of the video series, you will be convinced of the position I take as to whether academic science needs to be saved. You'll have achieved a nuanced understanding of the complex set of forces that led to how the academic system currently operates, and you'll also learn about new tools and standards being developed to help improve the situation. And so there is light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to be talking about very heavy stuff, a lot of pretty dark, tragically or devastatingly tragic or tragically devastating situations, but there's a lot of positive. And so let's keep that in mind. It's really probably the most exciting time to be in science. So briefly, I'm a research fellow in meta-science at KU Leuven, a prominent university in Belgium, and I'm only mentioning this to establish my credibility. I've been in academia, as I said, for 20 years, the last 12 of which I've spent doggedly fighting for higher standards. See my website, etiennelebel.com, which will be linked below, for more details about my professional credentials and achievements. And again, I'm only mentioning this to establish my credibility, which also means my reputation is on the line. And so if I'm way off here, my reputation could be tarnished. But as you'll see, I also hope that I'm wrong and that people can prove me wrong. So in the spirit of the scientific method, I invite any and all criticism and feedback about any statements I make which you believe are incorrect and or mischaracterized. And I really mean this, because everyone has their biases, even when you study bias yourself. And then there's some stories about this. It gets pretty twisted that researchers studying decision making, the area of study that studies human biases, they themselves have been very biased in reporting their research. And so my motivations, briefly, I'm doing this because I believe strongly that it's the responsibility of intellectuals to report on matters of public concern. But I'm doing this begrudgingly, reluctantly. I definitely would prefer to be doing something more fun, like developing delicious software. But I feel it's my ethical duty to publicly report about this. The stakes are very high. Science affects the lives of everyone. And indeed, a compelling case can be made that every year, millions of people die and suffer unnecessarily because of bad academic research. And I'll review specific examples of this, which does get a bit dark. But it's the reality, and it needs to be discussed. And in fact, several of my own close family members and friends have been affected and have died and suffered from medical conditions, rather, for which treatments have stagnated because of bad academic research. And of course, this is a claim I'm making. But again, I really wish that I'm wrong here, because I have a personal stake in science working correctly because of my personal situation. So I lost an aunt to suicide in childhood. I lost my only brother to suicide when I was 22, and then also lost a first cousin to suicide 3 years after my brother's tragic death. So I not only have an ethical duty to report on this, but I'm personally affected. I have a personal stake in improving the academic system so that we can accelerate progress on treatments for these vicious conditions that continue to kill millions, several million people per year, including, sadly, probably some of your own loved ones. So this is very serious at so many levels. So let's just jump right in. Does science need to be saved? Before getting to the stories, we need to familiarize ourselves with the environment in which academics operate or work in. And so we'll be using this diagram. And for audio-only listeners, I'll just do my best at visually describing what we're seeing. And so you can see individual researchers here at the bottom. They are embedded in the system of other key players. So generally, a researcher works for a university, and then with that university position gets grants from the public sector or nonprofit sector, and with those resources conduct research and then hopefully find something interesting, and then compete ferociously to publish papers in the most read, most high impact journals, most prestigious journals, which then leads to personal and professional rewards, like boosting your ego and, more importantly, giving you promotions in your job at the university. And then you get larger grants, potentially, with prestigious publications. And then with those even larger resources, then you can do even more fancy research to hopefully get more glamorous publications, and so on. And you can also then start getting awards, distinguished career awards from professional societies, and so on. And this can become a vicious cycle. And as a lot of lay people now have heard, the publish or perish problem of academia is highly pernicious in it. But we'll get back to this because it's a lot more nuanced. There's a lot more complexities in the different parts of the system that may have gone awry. And so we begin by focusing on individual researchers, because of course they are the key player. And the first story, so again, I'll be telling stories from my own experiences and then relating them to other people's stories. And then we also can so-called corroborate those stories in actual meta-scientific evidence and other more objective evidence. Because of course, my stories are just anecdotal evidence, which means they should carry very little weight. But when you combine them and then you compare them to other more objective evidence, then you can start painting a compelling picture regarding the current state of academia. And so the first story aims to demonstrate cognitive and emotional biases that all humans have, including trained scientists who are very intelligent, are nonetheless highly biased in cognitive ways and emotional ways. And so my first story is from my early days in grad school. I was doing my master's thesis, which is kind of your main final project, research project. And I had done a study which gave us positive results that were very promising. But then we followed up with 2 other studies that were tweaked a little bit that did not give the predicted results. And I was pretty disappointed, of course. So this comes the emotional biases. You pour your heart and soul in designing the studies, running the studies, making sure you've done everything meticulously well, and then you get negative results, and then it's unclear. Well, what does this mean? Is this going to delay my master's? Is this going to delay my career advancement? And my advisor, when we met to discuss the situation, he told me something that shocked me. Because remember, I did 1 study that worked, and then 2 studies that totally didn't work. I mean, they weren't even close. He said, well, it's disappointing, but you can just write up the first study and ignore the 2 other studies, because we'll be following up on this research, and you know, we don't really understand what's going on. So and the study is ambitious, and you know, for a master's thesis it's sufficient. And so I want to keep this as brief as possible, but the key points are that he's that they are teaching me that suppressing negative or inconclusive evidence is okay. But we were already biased in terms of confirmation bias, for example, to interpret the evidence in line with our predictions and in line with the first study. But now you are teaching that interpreting evidence in a biased way is okay. But we'll get, so that's one part of it. And then we would be involved in writing other papers about other research results. And sometimes it would be data that had already been collected that were given to us. And we would be in charge to draft the first manuscript of what did we do, what did we find, and why is this theoretically important. And in all cases, and when I say we, I had an office mate, so we shared a lot of these same experiences. But then we learned it was ubiquitous across labs, across grad students, especially the more prominent labs, and that also, I guess, need to be mentioned briefly. Again, not just for the sake of establishing credibility. So it's not like we were working in a lab with an incompetent professor. We were actually considered to be one of the wealthiest, most funded labs, and kind of based on the prominence of the lab director. Let's put it that way. So we were being trained to write papers, and in almost all cases, no, not almost, all cases, the manuscript, we would try to describe it as we had done the study, just following basic principles of the scientific method that you learn in high school. That basically you need to provide all the details so that the reader can properly evaluate your claims. But in all cases, the manuscript would go from a more honest reporting of what happened and what we found to a less honest picture. And we would sometimes push back, but it seemed clear that, well, first of all, he just would not change his position. Okay, let's clarify something. So I'm telling these stories, and I'm trying not to name names because the point of this is not to target anyone. But of course, some of these stories may make others look unfavorable. So I'm trying to anonymize most of the stories where the person, it doesn't matter. These are general problems. And so I will avoid names and pronouns as much as possible, except maybe for the more public behaviors where these things happened on Twitter and in the mainstream media, where I can name names because it's already very public. And because the goal, again, is just to present facts and assess the state of academia and then see what we can do to improve the situation forever. And that's it. The intention is not to make anyone look bad, basically, but there are limits to that. So we were trained to oversell evidence. We were salesmen that had a clear purpose. We need to get this paper past the reviewers. We even had this expression, not sure if they'll get past the reviewers. And we would debate different ways to frame the paper that would be more or less compelling in terms of persuading the peer reviewers and the editor. So a quick, or again, for the more general audience, in academia, when you submit your paper to a journal, there's what's called an editor or action editor that handles your paper. And if they don't reject it right away, which is usually what happens, they then send it out to 2 or 3 other professors who are supposed to be experts or at least somewhat qualified to review the paper. But as we'll see, there's lots of problems with this system. Not just that it's hard to find people to review papers for free because they're not paid for this work, but they don't have enough time. They don't spend enough time, typically I think 1 to 2 hours, and they don't have enough details, as we'll see, in terms of transparency. So a lot of meetings, a lot of time was spent. How can we pitch? We would have the expression, how can we pitch this to reviewers? As if you're pitching a product for investors or you're actually trying to sell a product in retail. And, it was fun. And, again, you're being trained. Most grad students either never even thought to question these techniques we were learning. But even if they thought it was weird, they would never bring it up for fear of backlash, because your professor, another thing to mention is, in the academic world, at the end of your PhD, you have to apply for jobs, or now postdocs, which is kind of a in-between position between being a PhD student and becoming a junior professor. They write the letters of reference for you that are required to apply for jobs. So it's right away you can see a major problem, that because there's so much on the line, you really don't want to piss off your professor. So you're not even in a position where you can criticize or even question, because even if you question too much, then they will insinuate that you're potentially onto them. And so, yeah, that's a very big problem. And again, there's discussions of it, perpetual discussions, but no action. So, with the most obvious one, that they should just not be used. And they've even shown that because you usually would get you get at least 3 or 4 reference letters from 3 or 4 different professors, but the main letter is from your advisor. And so you could, as long as you have one good letter from your advisor, because that's the most important, because they know you the best, right? But the easiest solution is just get rid of them, because, they've even shown that if you compare the consistency of the letters of reference, they're not even consistent. And most professors, they have a template of just generic compliments, and they just fill in the person's name and change it a little bit. So they've done studies and they found that letters of reference reflect more the professors who are writing them, rather than the letters than the people the letters are about. Anyway, so as a grad student, you're in this intense pressure cooker situation where you have to get positive results, you have to get papers, you have to get publications as a PhD student. And again, this was not always the case. Even just 20 years ago, it was more common, at least in psychology, for a professor to be able to get a job without a single publication. You would have working papers, is means you have a paper that you're currently writing. It's kind of still in draft format, but it's about you're completing it. It's a working paper. And then your dissertation would be usually a very long paper, right? So you have some stuff in the pipeline, but and professors, this is just a true fact that things have got more competitive, and now you need insane numbers of publications and awards and media attention to be competitive for professor positions. So that's really important to keep in mind. And well, the emotional investment we already mentioned, but another quick story was going for lunch, and you're at work, you're discussing your projects, and the most common theme was studies not working out, or this not working out, this paper being rejected, and you could really see the emotional frustration of, I still haven't got my study to work, and I've spent 2 years, and we might have to give up, and so. And again, this is natural for humans to have emotions, but that's why, again, you need sufficient transparency standards so that you're not fooling yourself, first and foremost. And so other issues at stake here for individual researchers is ideological biases. And this I really only figured out much later, after I spent brief periods of time, well, that got longer and longer outside of academia. So I was kind of in and out of academia for a few years, depending on how you count and how you define academia. But in retrospect, and now we know a lot more about ideological problems in academia, and these get contentious. So I'll do my best to remain even-handed, I guess. But an example of at the time, so academics typically have what's sometimes called lunch series talks or brown bag talks, where once a week someone presents about their research, whether it's published or just in the works. So there was a grad student presenting about her research, and she was studying weight bias and the different stigma that overweight individuals suffer, right? Like staring and people teasing or bullying. But she herself was overweight. And I'm only mentioning this because it's relevant. I mean, and she was studying, the study was along the lines of, we're going to look at in a hiring context, do people display biases against overweight individuals in terms of interviews when you're hiring people, where you keep everything constant except the weight of the person. And she had some mixed evidence. But then in the discussion period, there's a professor, an older professor, who kind of just questioned kind of a hidden assumption, I guess, which was that discriminating against overweight individuals kind of was inherently always bad. And again, he asked the question in a very polite, very nuanced way. And still right away, the grad student presenting became kind of emotionally flustered for obvious reasons. And everyone kind of attacked him, including the professor of the student, for being mean or just very archaic, I guess. And he tried to defend himself, but it was just, it was like people were attacking him so much, he had to kind of just storm out of the room, pretty upset, and just said something like, "You people don't understand," or something. And at the time, I was more siding with the majority of the people, where, you would definitely never want to endorse weight discrimination, but he was saying specifically for he even brought up, so for a work situation like a newscast broadcast anchor, if it's a private company where they hire individuals, shouldn't there be a possibility that there would be a market for the news anchor female to be attractive or be a bit more attractive, because you have to look at her while she's telling the news. And that also backfired. And at the time, I thought it was pretty disgusting. But now I can see his point. And so this demonstrates an ideological bias, where in academia, and we now know the vast majority of people, professors, and grad students, they are leaning more left in terms of this progressive left-wing social progressive position. And so being conservative, you would almost never have conservative or professors who are conservative. And if you did, they were like what's known as closet conservatives, right? They were conservative, but they didn't talk about it, and you had to be hush hush. And so, and this might seem like, well, why does this matter? But in psychology, well, any science, your personal beliefs can influence how you even design a study and how you interpret the results. And if there's not a counterpoint, if there's not sufficient diversity, but now we mean true diversity, like intellectual diversity, political diversity, viewpoint diversity, as it's now known. And that was not even discussed. It was just assumed that the progressive position is the correct one, and any other positions is kind of emotionally disgusting, or it's just not part. I think how I saw it too is it was just kind of like, well, if you're an educated person, you should be progressive, right? It's just kind of, but it's like ideologies are like the water that fish swim in. Fish don't realize they're swimming in water because they've always swam in that water, right? So it was a bit like that. And when I took some time off from academia, I realized, wow, there was a pretty homogeneous group of people. And if you question certain core beliefs, they became very emotional, very defensive, and they would socially kind of you would suffer socially. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying ostracism, but they would kind of pressure you socially to not even question some of these core beliefs, which we'll get back to. And so, right, so we now know there's an underrepresentation of conservative professors, and there's a group called Heterodox Academy, which I strongly recommend looking into and signing up. So you can be a member to show, and I'm a member, full disclosure, to show solidarity with the fact that viewpoint diversity, universities need to not just accommodate different viewpoints, they need to encourage it and reward it. So that we can avoid echo chambers, groupthink, and this is not, we're not talking about being incivil, right? So we should all be respectful and civil and aim for civil, constructive discussions. I mean, that's just obvious. I mean, anytime you deal with someone else, whether it's a stranger or your professor or your friend, you should try to be a nice person. But if you're talking about ideas and general ideas, oh man, you should be able to question any idea, especially if you're in university, because that's the point of a university, is to discuss ideas and dissect ideas and criticize ideas. And so that's the other thing that needs to be mentioned. Sorry, is that this is particularly dark because academia should be the last place where ideas are censored and restricted, right? I mean, it's just so obvious. So that's not good. But again, there's improvements. And Heterodox Academy website used to have a ranking system where you could go and check out the different universities and how they're doing in terms of censoring speech and but they somehow took it down. And maybe they got pressure. Some universities wasn't liking it. Okay, so So now we have cognitive biases, emotional biases, political, ideological biases. We got ego pursuit. So we have to realize the whole system, the whole environment. You're dealing with highly accomplished people who are mostly highly intelligent and who've been told for many years that they are among the smartest in the world, right? So these are high achieving, high ego individuals to begin with. And then as they succeed through the academic ranks, their ego gets even more inflated and their sense of self-importance can get very high. And, it was just the reality that, again, most academics are fine, normal people, but there was still a larger percentage of kind of borderline arrogant and narcissistic people who really were self-centered and just, their ideas are the best, and they're interrupting each other all the time, and they're just kind of like just always talking over each other, and some of the kind of socially autistic in a sense. And oh man. Yeah, I've got a headache. Might have to continue this. So let's just finish this at least. Yeah, we'll just finish this part about individual researchers. So yes, so there's high stake rewards, as you can start seeing. Being a professor comes with incredible status, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but with power comes responsibility. So when you meet people, you say, "I'm a professor," and I was a professor briefly in New Jersey, and I experienced this, and it was insane. I mean, people would meet you, and they'd be, "Oh, nice to meet you, Dr. Labelle." Oh, and they're like bowing, almost like bowing, and I was like, "What are you doing? Just call me by my first name." And students will call you doctor, and right, but that's not necessarily a problem. But it's to show that being a professor is a high power, high status position, so people listen to you more, and you actually have impact. You write op-eds for the New York Times. These people are writing best-selling books. They have viral TED Talks, and now with social media, I mean, it's just so much easier to reach millions of people who want to know about social psychology and relationships and health research and so, but that's okay as long as there's accountability. With great power comes great responsibility. How can you be responsible with what you're publishing, what your ideas you're disseminating? Well, not our idea, and the idea is that transparency leads to accountability, because if there's minimum transparency standards, then it's, again, harder to fool yourself, but then it's easier for others to look into the facts and realize that you've been fooling them. So and then there's wealth, and there's outside financial interests. So now there's a growing concern that, well, especially in the natural sciences and chemistry, biology, a lot of professors, I don't have hard numbers, but it seems like almost maybe a near majority of professors have outside commercial interests, meaning they are part of some startup or patents for private commercial interests of developing products based on their research. But, and again, that's always existed. even in the time of Lavoisier and the discovery of oxygen. But it's probably more potent, more common. No, but either way, even if it's always been a problem, it is currently a problem and needs to be kind of, you need to account for that. And media attention, we already mentioned that. So there's never been a time where getting media attention from newspapers, from news channels, new media, social media, and people are hungry for the latest science on relationships, the latest science on health. So that is the context of this, high stake, high competition, hyper competitive environment in which academics operate. And so if you combine all these things, even just at the individual researcher level, this is a perfect storm for abuse of power and corruption. And so even if you have the best intentions, and this is very important, that even the researchers with the best intentions that are trying to be as honest as possible have literally 5, 6 strong forces pulling them away from the pursuit of truth, which is what your main job should be as a scientist. So again, we acknowledge these natural human biases, these ideological biases, ego pursuit, but even then, so we're not just talking about bad apples. There's always going to be bad apples in any field, in any professional field, but that's also why we need high standards to make it less tempting to commit fraud in the first place. And this we'll review maybe briefly with Diederik Stapel in the Netherlands case. So this was it's still, I think, top 3 worst fraud cases in the history of science of all time, where he fabricated data in over 60 publications for almost 20 years before getting caught. So and he described this kind of perfect storm of high stakes, high rewards, and perceived tiny chance of getting caught. Right? And it's the combination of those two things, right? And so but you can't reduce the stakes, because again, you can't get away. You can't just make media attention disappear. You can't make status and wealth and ego. You can't. Those things will always exist. The only thing you can change is the perceived chance of getting caught, and that's through accountability measures, which generally means transparency. So that's the stage, and yeah. Oh, well, actually, I forgot to mention insufficient statistics and methods training. That's pretty easy. It's just too low, and a lot of psychologists don't even have basic high school math, and then they're doing statistics, fumbling around. I mean, there's tons of stories where a professor would tell a grad student to do statistical analyses that just don't make sense. Like, we're talking really, really bad. But yeah, I don't really want to get into the details. But maybe in a subsequent series, because depending on the response, I could go even longer. But I also, right now, I want to keep it shorter so that it's more accessible to more general audience. So, Oh, and it's not just insufficient statistics training, it's methods. So methods meaning, how do you even design a scientific study to study a phenomena? So you're interested in some topic, some phenomena, right? So research methods training is what kind of design, how are you going to observe and test hypotheses? And in those ways, they're sufficient, they're insufficiently trained as well. And we'll get back to the fact that they on the whole, and this is psychologists, no, I don't know, social sciences more generally, is generally would use way simplistic, overly simplistic designs, statistical designs, to study very complex things that were never, those things were never meant to be used. So a lot of these techniques come from agrarian research. So Ronald Fisher, the great Ronald Fisher, who is considered kind of a founder or one of the co-founders of statistics, was doing research with crops and corn, growing corn, and seeing what the best way, what are the best nutrients. But those techniques, which are called between groups designs, they were never really meant for studying humans. But because they're the simplest, and because statistics training is insufficient, it was just kind of, well, that's what my professor used, so I'm using it, kind of more like tradition. You're trying to use a flawed method, and then well, it's not always flawed. Anyways, it's insufficiently nuanced, insufficiently sophisticated designs, and which is partly not their fault. But again, as a scientist, you need to be accountable. Whether you were trained wrong, it's always up to you to make sure you're up to speed on the best techniques to study your topics. All right. I don't think I can continue. This headache. So we'll see you next time. Signing off.